Welcome everybody to our latest weekly drop-in session. So this session is what we're looking at here is around putting together I've called it a project plan for your process project. Really what this is about is it's about trying to establish the scope of the project and starting to put together a list of processes that you're going to that are going to form part or the basis of the process library. One of the reasons for running this session is it's a common question we get asked, or a challenge that we see a lot of teams face, is a couple of things. One is just about getting started. So often at the beginning of a project like this, it can feel a little bit overwhelming in terms of what needs to be done. There can be hundreds of processes that need to be captured. It's like, where do we start? Which ones do we look at? Often processes, there's often confusion about what level of detail are the processes. Are they big strategic processes or small tactical processes? So essentially what I want to try and cover in the next 15 minutes or so is just give some sort of pointers and tips and tricks really about how to get started, but also to how to think a little bit longer term about where this is going. So I'm going to start off with why we need a plan in the first place. And so I like this idea of, every big change or big project, the way to delivering a successful change or project is about taking small steps to get there. If we're going to try and climb a mountain, you've got to go there one step at a time. So get to be able to, you'll never get to the top of the mountain if you never get started. So key bit of advice is to just start taking steps and moving forward. The peak of the mountain, you think of the idea of if the weather's bad, if there's lots of low cloud, you can't see the peak of the mountain, but you can start walking in the right direction and start making progress up there. And it can often feel like that with a process project because again, you might not know exactly what the end thing is going to look like, the end product's going to look like, but to start building processes out as you start to build different processes out, you'll start to see how they connect together and the picture will start to emerge as you progress. So that advice about just getting started, we do that because inertia in these projects is often the main thing that stops them. It prevents them from happening in the first place often, or prevarication as well, talking a lot about what to do and not actually doing it. The other thing that's worth noting with a lot of these projects is, so as time progresses, the focus of what you're doing might change. So often in the early stages, and again, a lot of the teams we work with, there is often a short to mid-term target or goal that we need to hit. It might be that the initial part of what you're doing is driven by some sort of maybe a systems implementation project or something similar, and therefore there is a scope or a subset of processes that need to be defined as part of that program in order to understand the requirements. But there's still a longer goal about documenting processes in other areas outside the scope of that program. So it's important to keep moving all the time. If you stop, I've said here, inertia can be the biggest killer, but also important to remember that if your goal is continuous improvement, then continuous improvement by its nature of being continuous has no end. So you need to think about the strategy and the steps, the big pieces of work that you'll need to get to cover to be able to deliver that strategy. The other thing about having a plan, and even if you're sort of focused on the next 3 months or the next 6 months or whatever, is it's that feeling of making progress. Because again, without a plan and just going, right, well, I'm going to map this process, and as soon as I finish this one, I'm going to go around and find out what the next one is, I can map and so on. It can be harder to see and feel the progress that you or the wider team are making through this. So again, having a plan shows, we set out to map these 30 processes. We're halfway through, we've done 27 and we've got 13 left to go or whatever. And so you can both you can demonstrate to other people that you're making progress, but also to yourself as well. So that's why it's good to have a plan. When we think about plan, it's really important to understand where that plan sits within the wider vision and strategy. So again, it might be that, and it's often easier if, as I said before, you're embarking on this as part of, say, a very specific project, like a systems implementation project, because that has a nicely defined scope. It's easy to get your arms around and understand what it is. But if there is a vision and a goal to go on beyond that project, to go and do more processes, to move into continuous improvement, you've got to understand what that vision and strategy is. Where is it you're trying to get to? So just to sort of try and illustrate this a little bit more, I'm using the process maturity model that we've shared often in the past. In fact, I think in a couple of weeks we've got another drop-in session where we're going to go into the maturity model and look at it in a bit more detailed. But just to sort of summarize the maturity model here, typically, if you're not doing anything with processes, if you're not looking at processes, if you're just doing work and hoping that it all turns out right, then you're probably sat down here in this unstructured level where there's no documentation and no real visibility of the processes. Tactical is where we are documenting processes, but in a real ad hoc way. So typically it's in reaction to a specific requirement. And again, that might be, we just need to look at the process for how we close opportunities or how we raise an invoice, but it's not connected. It's not in context. We're just looking at something very, very tactical and need to document that process. And typically processes documented in that way, they end up just being sort of pushed to one side once you've fixed the problem and forgotten about. When we move into strategic, this is when we're proactively documenting processes. So this is typically where this is the point of the journey where we at Skore are meeting most organizations. They are in that journey from tactical to strategic. So they've traditionally done stuff in a very ad hoc way, but they want to move to that sort of strategic. Can we define processes at an organizational level so we can see how all the key processes all hang together and interact and relate to each other? But even in doing that, there's still a danger that you go and do that piece of work, and it's very valuable because it helps you understand how the organization works today. But those processes can then be put on the shelf and left to gradually go out of date. And so organizations trying to address that problem can then often move into the embedded phase. So that's when they haven't just documented the process, but they've made sure that they're clearly owned, they're measured, and therefore because they're measured, the owners are then using it to go, okay, how do we improve the performance of this particular area? And then the final level is really that sort of continuous improvement level, where we call it agile and resilient, where you've got the whole organization involved and engaged with continuous process improvement. So why this is important? So it's important because when you're setting out at the beginning, again, if I go back to my example, if you're in that level where traditionally you've done things very tactically, but you're moving up to, you want to move up to strategic. What's the long-term view? Is the goal to get to continuous improvement, to be agile and resilient? It might not be. Not every organization wants to get there. They might just want to get to strategic and be happy to stay there, or they might be just wanting to get to the embedded, or indeed get to the very top. But it's good to have that bigger picture, because it may influence some of the decisions you make early on. And it also means you need to be then aware of where you are and where you're trying to get to next. So if you're tactical getting to 3, which is really what I'm talking about, that's really where you've got to think about what is the list of processes that we're trying to capture and that we're trying to define. When you're moving from strategic to embedded, your project plan is going to be different because you've already got a list of processes, or at least you've probably got 90% of the processes documented. There might still be some gaps to fill. and therefore it's looking more at how do you drive that ownership, how do you understand what the key performance indicators are, how do you ensure that the process is adhered to and the process is delivering on those key performance indicators and so on. So it's a different type of work that you're doing at that point in time. So again, just to reiterate, what I'm talking about here is that moving from tactical to strategic. We want to get to a point where we've got an organizational view of all the processes. So again, important to define that vision, understand the strategy. How far are you going up there? What are the steps you're taking? And where are you now? So then you can start moving on to actually creating the plan. And this one, there's no kind of like perfect way of doing this. But again, it's that idea of getting started, or trying to avoid the inertia. So there's different ways to start with. Ultimately, you've just got to start with putting a list together. What do we think the processes are? And it doesn't matter if you're talking about big end-to-end processes like order to cash or procure to pay, or you're right down in the weeds talking about the expenses processes or the raising an invoice process or whatever it is. Just get a list of processes, just get a list of ideas. So brainstorm, chuck ideas onto a whiteboard, onto a page with a group of people, because you'll very quickly start to realize, actually, so we've talked about a procure to pay process. So raising a purchase order probably sits in there, expenses probably sits in purchase to pay, and so on. Order to cash, you've got raise invoice process, that's probably a subset of order to cash. So just going through that exercise will help you start to do that. But there are a couple of tips and tricks that you might want to apply. So if you've got that initial just list of ideas, but you're still sort of struggling to think about, are these big processes or small processes, are they subsets of other ones? A couple of little things to start doing is start taking some of those processes and say, okay, we've defined a process here. Try to think about the scope. So you might think of something like SIPOCs, so SIPOC stands for supplier, customer, so supplier, input, process, output, customer. So you take one of those process ideas you've put on the list and you start asking, okay, so what's the input? What triggers this process to happen? And how do we know when it's finished? Who is providing that input? And when we finish, you'll then start to realize, oh, okay, and that then links to that process, and that one links to that one. And actually, those three processes are all just part of the same chain, and they're a subset of that. So really just kind of having that starting to have that conversation and will start to help you form that list of processes. Again, the list itself doesn't need to be perfect. As it starts to form, you'll go, okay, yeah, that's clearly a process. That's just a subset or a detailed activity that we'll catch later on. And again, that idea of just taking steps. So once you've got an initial list, you can start going and mapping those processes. And even as you start doing that, you might realize that some of the things you thought were processes are just subsets of one that you've already mapped. And it doesn't matter, because once you've done that, you can just strike that one off the list and you've got it done. Another tool for helping you think about what the processes might be is to go out and use an existing framework. So these are really good at high level stuff. So for those of you who've been in our sessions before, you'll be familiar with APQC. You've probably heard us talk about it. If not, you can go to their website. They have free resources, what they call the process classification framework. It's a big spreadsheet that gives you really high level view of generic organizations. They do have industry specific versions, and you can break those down. They're hierarchically arranged into sort of detailed processes. Really, really good benchmark for helping you just go, right, okay, are these processes relevant to us? And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second in Skore. And then ultimately, you want to get to a point where you've got a nice list of processes, but in order to start then planning, there's some other key information that you need to know. So when you create a plan, your plan, whether you're going to do it in something like Microsoft Project, or whether you're going to do it in something like Monday.com, or you're just going to have a spreadsheet, right, which normally works just as well as anything else. Sorts of things you want to have in there is, what is the process you're going to capture? Have you defined the scope? So I mentioned before the inputs and outputs. Really, another really good tool actually, and this might help when you're brainstorming what the processes might be, is defining a purpose. So when we talk about the purpose, it's why do we do this process? What's the value that that this process delivers to the person who's ultimately going to be the customer of it? And that can be a really interesting conversation to help you think about whether you should even be doing that process in the first place, let alone whether you're going to document it. So have you defined the process? Because these are all key steps on the journey to building your process library. Who's the owner of the process? Who's the editor? So when I talk about the editor here, I'm talking about who's the actual person who's going to go out and document this process on behalf of the owner. Do you know who the key stakeholders or subject matter experts might be? So in this case, when you're planning, most likely, some processes are going to have lots and lots of stakeholders across the organization, and it's not always feasible to include all of those in the documentation. But if you're going to be running process workshops to gather these processes, who are you going to invite to those workshops? So who are those people? Have those defined? Because you need to know who those people are for the next one, which is when are you going to do those workshops? What date are you going to target those for? Because you're going to need to work with those stakeholders to make sure they're available. Now what you can start to do is, so once you've got your workshop date defined, of course you can have some sort of status. Have we started this? Is it in progress? Whatever. So that's the first bit, is about documenting the process. But you can also think beyond that. So again, if you're using this as Skore, documenting the process is one thing, but then saving that as a baseline for future process development is the next step. So has that process been approved and published by the owner? And again, in Skore, once you've approved and published a process, it's got a version number against it. So as you develop that process over time, you can see how it's changing. You can give confidence to people who are viewing that process that they're seeing the latest version of the process. Now, the next stage is really where you're starting to think beyond that level 3 in the maturity model, so that strategic view. So if your vision is to go beyond that, whether it's to go to the embedded or to go right through to the sort of continuous improvement piece, you can start thinking about these things right now and start preparing for them. So you might have that process might be captured, you may have even published it, but have you started to define the measures for it? Because if you've clearly defined a purpose for this process, i.e. what's the value, what is the value to the customer of this process, then you should be able to then understand what needs to be measured to make sure you're delivering on that value. And again, this is one of those key pieces which becomes more important in the next phase, but it's not a major piece of work to start thinking about it now. And then another piece here is around reviews. So again, if you're not familiar with it, Skore has the ability to schedule recurring reviews into the future. So have you scheduled those reviews? Or even if you're not using a feature like reviews, you should still be regularly reviewing the process. So what's the cadence or frequency at which those reviews are going to take place, and when is the next one scheduled in? Because that starts to become your ongoing plan to make sure that reviews are actually being completed by the teams and so on. So what I'm going to do is just quickly show a couple of ways in Skore to do this, or to help do this. As I said, there's no reason why you couldn't stand around a whiteboard and brainstorm the ideas, or indeed use Skore with sticky notes to brainstorm ideas and then go and stick them into a spreadsheet. But we have various tools in the product that help you do this as well. So I mentioned using APQC as a framework. We have a generic version of the APQC framework available. Again, if you're using Skore and you want a copy of this, do let us know and we can share. I think it's available as a template when you're creating a new process within Skore. So you'll see we've created the very high level view of this, the high level process steps broken down into operational and support processes. And then if I take any example here, but if I take market and sell products and services, again, what I've done is we've just used a what box to define the different processes that the APQC have defined in the classification framework. But what you will see here is that some of the boxes are different colors. And the reason they're different colors is what we've done is we have used custom fields here to define whether we've started to document this process, whether it's in progress or it's complete. So the one I picked there, you can see it's not started. I've called the custom field process catalog and set it to not started. If I go and click on one of these orange boxes here, you'll see it's in progress and we've even got some notes against it. If I take the green one and click on that, you can see it's set to complete and there's even a link there that goes to that particular process. And then what we've done is we've used the style rules within the product to basically say, if it's complete, make the box green, if it's in progress, make it orange, and if it's not started, make it gray. So this does a couple of things. One, you use the APQC framework just to help think about the processes that you want to include in your library. You can delete the boxes that you don't want. You can change or add boxes as you want them. And then you can add the custom fields to say whether it's not started or in progress or complete. So visually, you can then see almost like a heat map to say which ones are done, which ones are in progress, and which ones haven't started. But equally, what this does is it allows you to then go and also pull a report. I've called the custom field process catalog. So it'll pull a report that shows me all that information in the custom field. Again, the not started, the status field, if you like. But equally, I can also use the analytics. And again, if I go and look at the process catalog there, the analytics then gives you an overview of the progress. So I can see, look, I've got 10 not started, 6 in progress, and 6 complete. So just by, you've got different sort of ways of visually looking at one, you can sort of see a status of each process area, and then here you can see an overall progress of it. That's quite nice because it's all interconnected and dynamic. Another way that you can do this, and we've got a team doing this at the moment, is using the new documents feature within Skore. Again, if you're not familiar with that, it's a new feature. So I think it's only sort of in pre-release at the moment. But again, if you're interested in having a look, let us know and we can look to share this. But here's an example, again, using the same APQC framework to understand what the different processes might be, but just using a simple table within a document to list out what the process is, using a little icon to show status visually, and then actually providing links off to the different processes. You can obviously add more columns to this to put in different pieces of information as well. But again, if clicking on this will open the necessary process. So you've got one place you can come and see, you can see the list of processes, the status of them, other information such as owner and so on, and then link off to those processes. Thank you very much for coming along today. We will post out on, I think, Mondays, that the message goes out to let you know what the next session is. But once again, thank you very much for coming along today, and look forward to seeing you again next week.